Hi, I'm Dave Gardy from Maritime TV for this special presentation from our studios here near Washington, D.C. And joining us on the line is crew members from the Meredith Victory, in addition to Father Sinclair and a whole host of other people. And I'm going to throw it to Father Sinclair to tell us a story that is fascinating in terms of maritime history. Father Sinclair?
Well, thank you so much, Dave. It's great that Maritime TV is helping us get this story out. It was a real surprise whenever I was talking to Ned Barney, who's living in Korea, and his grandfather was leading the process of evacuation from Hunan. And he reminded us that today, September 15th, is the day that the Inchon landing took place. And part of that landing was a large convoy of U.S. merchant ships, and one of those ships was the Meredith Victory. Now, the day before, September 14th, 1950, they ran right into the teeth of a major typhoon. And with us today are two of the living crew members, Burley Smith and Merle Smith. They have the same name. They are not brothers. They are with us today. One was the third engineer on the Meredith Victory. The other one was the third mate on the same ship. With us also is Philip Lacavara. And Philip has been working diligently to prepare a book about the Meredith Victory. Captain Leonard Larue, who were engaged in a cause for sainthood. And I've asked Phil to be able to share some of his background story of what he's discovered in the process of doing this biography. But I want to focus specifically with Merle and Burley and get your stories, because both of you are graduates of the 1950 class of Kings Point, right?
Right.
And so, so you graduate, you mentioned that the Korean War just started shortly after you graduated. Take us through the process of both of you getting this ship. How did you get this ship? Burley, let's start with you.
Well, at graduation, I went home, having applied to Moore McCormick Lines in New York for a berth on one of their South American or Scandinavian ships. And it usually takes a week or two for them to find a place. So in the meantime, I drove a taxi in Atlantic City in the summer for about a month, waiting for a job offer from Mormac. And must have been the middle of July, I got a call from Mormac saying, "We have a ship for you down in Norfolk, Virginia. It's being taken out of the James River reserve fleet. After the war, we had so many ships that were no longer required that they were laid up and mothballed down in the James River at this huge anchorage." So I took a train down to Norfolk, went out onto the ship, and it took a day or two. Merle can confirm. I think it must have taken about 2 or 3 days, Merle, for us to finish off getting the ship unwrapped, getting all the cocoons off it. And
it wasn't totally ready. We had to do some preparation.
Right. And then we sailed empty from Norfolk down to Panama through the canal and up to the Oakland Army base in San Francisco in Oakland, where we loaded for Korea.
Yeah. So Merle, what were you doing after graduation and between getting the billet on the Meredith Victory?
Well, when I graduated, it seemed to me, looking back a couple of years, that it wasn't very long. I wanted to go on Moore McCormick too, because, you know, it's nice sailing down there in that South Pacific or Atlantic. But they said they didn't have any ships available except one. It was in a dry dock and it was going around to the West Coast. Would I take that instead? Well, I was anxious to get a job, so I immediately said yes. And I forget exactly how much time it was from graduation to then, probably comparable to Burley's, except I didn't have time to look around. And so I went down to Norfolk and got on a ship. And I don't think we realized that we were getting involved in a Korean War. We knew we were going out to the West Coast, which was, that's what we signed on for. Right?
That's certainly correct, because I remember when we sailed from Norfolk, we were all in summer uniforms, just light short sleeve shirts and khaki pants. None of us had any gear, and we had no idea we were going to the Far East until we got out to Oakland.
And so when you arrived in Oakland, it was time to, you began loading stuff. Was that a surprise that you were taking on munitions?
Well, then we knew there was a war going on over there, starting over in Korea. And I don't think we were, because then you got to sign on again for the rest of for another trip. And it was obviously we were going to be involved in Korea, even though we were going to Japan first.
And so a big question that I have is, so you guys go to Japan, the war is going on, you know we're going to be bringing munitions, but the plans for the invasion had, I guess, were still pretty secret at that point. When did you guys know that you were going to be part of the Inchon landing convoy?
I had no idea. I followed whatever the mates did.
Actually,
I assumed Burley was informed ahead of me that where he was going to take the ship.
now, when we left Tokyo Bay with the rest of the fleet, there were 24 ships that MacArthur put together there. As we had, eventually we lined up with 3 lines of 8 ships each. We were the tail end ship in the right-hand line. And when we sailed from Yokohama, from Tokyo Bay, we didn't know where we were going, really. And the story was, this is one of these apocryphal tales, the story was that all the girls in the bars along the Yokohama waterfront knew where we were headed, but none of us on the ship did, and that the skippers didn't open their orders till we sailed. I'm not certain that that's true, Father Sinclair, but I think that's probably a fact, that the skippers weren't told either until we were underway. And
Philip, let me bring you in your own research on this subject with Captain Larue taking command of that vessel and also bringing him to Oakland. I know Bill Gilbert in his book tells a really important story for me as a priest, that when he prepared to leave Oakland, he made 3 visits in San Francisco, and one was to what today would be the Military Seaman Command, then also the McCormick Lands, and then he stopped at Old St. Patrick or Old St. Mary's Church in San Francisco to pray at that point. Do you have any background to sort of give some more color to what Merle and Earl and Burley were saying?
In the context of before leaving Oakland or from Yokohama?
Before leaving Oakland, period of time, and then sailing to Japan.
I guess what I can say is the orders that Meredith Victory had in leaving Oakland were decidedly vague. She was ordered to proceed to Japan and then receive orders from the military sea transportation officials there. Needless to say, there was no mention of Inchon, and as Burley has pointed out, some cargo was offloaded in Yokohama, other cargo was loaded. So the captain almost certainly didn't know specifically where they were going to be going, because even at that point, MacArthur didn't know where it was going to be going. So the notion that the ship would go to Inchon as being one of the most inhospitable places on the Korean coast for landing with 31-foot tides, that probably was the farthest thing from Captain Larue's mind.
Just to add there, Father Sinclair, when you mentioned Bob Lunny has told the story. Bob was the captain's clerk, the purser on the ship, and was handling paperwork and things like that. And on one of the trips ashore in Oakland, Bob tells the story of stopping on the way back to the ship with the skipper to drop off one of the churches to say a few prayers before we left for the Far East.
And that was picked up in Gilbert's book, The Ship of Miracles. And whenever I read that in the early 2000s, I was really touched by it. And it really sort of caused me to focus on Larue, because later on he leaves the sea and becomes a Benedictine monk. And then that sort of generates the whole process of interest of moving him toward a cause of canonization, a saint in the life of the church.
Just in that vein, jumping ahead a little bit, I can remember thinking back on Larue. He was a very quiet man. We could spend hours talking about his personality, but one definite scene I recall, he and I were standing on the port bridge wing. We were alongside a dock in Yokohama. And the sailors were all trooping ashore in the evening after cargo operations had ceased. And Larue said to me, he very seldom offered opinions on anything. He was a very quiet man. But he said, what a shame to see all these fellows trooping ashore to go after alcohol and women. Things like this, I never realized, but they did offend him, that sort of thinking. That was the first time I had any idea that he was a very sensitive sort of person in that respect.
Thank you, Burley, for that.
Hey, also with the captain, he was a type when we'd be down in a wardroom eating, because that's where I'd see him every day in there. But other captains I had been with as a cadet and all, you didn't hesitate to use a little profanity. But with Captain Larue, I just never swear. I just knew that wasn't proper when I was near him. You know what I mean? I just felt it. He wouldn't appreciate it. He was that type of person. So I was really good.
If he was alive, I'd have to clean up my language at that
I'm
point.
not speaking for the mates now. That's for me.
So one of the questions I have is, you arrive in Yokohama, how long were you there? Because as it was mentioned earlier, that even MacArthur didn't know exactly where he was going into. And just to also mention something that's come out recently, and that is Operation Chromite, which is a story about the Inchon landing and a group of South Korean imposters as North Koreans to find out information about Inchon and where the minefields were and those types of things. Very interesting movie, and certainly I would recommend people to see it. But how long after you arrived in Yokohama before you guys loaded and actually went on the convoy?
I tell you, I do know that all of us had a real sense of what was going on, and there was no doubt in our minds we were going to be involved in Korea.
I would think, Merle, that we must have been, I remember we were at anchor in Tokyo Bay after having been alongside the dock for a very short period. We had tanks aboard that we'd loaded in Oakland, the big tanks, which of course we didn't move around. They were mainly up on the main deck. We also loaded a lot of bridge building equipment, these quick installation bridges that the Army would put in, because as you remember, when we hitchhiked, Merle, that weekend from Busan up to Seoul, up to the front line, all the bridges had been blown. And as you'd go across the rivers and creeks, the Army would have to replace these things. It didn't bother the tanks. They'd go right through the rivers on the way up to the front, but trucks and things needed bridges. So we were in Tokyo Bay, I would guess, almost a week, certainly 4 or 5 days, because you and I and Caulfield and Lunny went one day, we went ashore and we went to visit that Kamakura Buddhist shrine. You recall that? One of the pictures I sent to Father Sinclair yesterday shows us at the shrine.
Yes. I remember we had plenty of time to do that. Yeah.
So well, that's actually a lot less time than I anticipated. You know, reading about, for instance, Captain Larue's experience in PQ-13 and hanging out, sometimes for months, you'd have to hang out waiting for a month, waiting for the convoy to assemble and then go to Murmansk. And this is actually about a week or so. So that actually sort of surprises me that it moved as quickly as it did by the time that you guys got there.
Well, remember, we arrived at Inchon the night of the 14th, landed the 15th. And it must have taken us 3 days, Merle, I think, to get from Tokyo around the bottom of Kyushu and the bottom of Korea and up the Yellow Sea to Inchon.
Yeah.
So we must have left Tokyo on about the 11th, I would guess, 10th or 11th of September. And it took us probably 9 days from Oakland to Tokyo. So we didn't leave Norfolk until, you know, you can sort of work it back But I would say, Father, that we weren't in Tokyo, I think, for more than, say, a week at the most at Anchorage. Most of
That'd be
the time.
about right. Yeah.
So let me just move the conversation forward. That MacArthur declares that he's going to go into Inchon, and I didn't even realize, but yeah, 30-foot tides is a tough challenge to move into. And y'all begin the voyage across, and then we just a couple of weeks ago got whacked with Hurricane Laura, which was a Category 4 that's decimated Lake Charles, Southwest Louisiana, and parts of Southeast Texas. But you guys were in the teeth of this typhoon that looks like it was about a Category 4 or so. Can y'all relate the story of what takes place at that point?
Well, the typhoon snuck up behind us. It was Typhoon Keza. I think that's the way it's pronounced. And we didn't have a lot of forewarning of it. If we had any at all, it would have been 24 hours or so. Remember, our only communication in those days was a radio telegraph operator. We had one radio man, and it was Morse key. So weather reports were sort of few and far between. I'm sure up on the lead ships where MacArthur was on the large troop transports, they were a lot more sophisticated, but we didn't even have radio telephones that were working. There was a radio telephone aboard, but for the most part, it was either restricted so that we couldn't use it because of, they didn't want the enemy knowing where we were, or just the range, we were out of range of anything usable. So there was very little warning, but this thing came up behind us, probably about 4 or 5 p.m. on the evening of the 14th. It came up from our left-hand quarter, the port quarter, snuck up behind us, so that we had, which was the worst position for these huge waves and winds. Each wave in the height of the typhoon at around 8 o'clock, when we did that stupendous roll, was about 50 feet high because the bridge wings were 50, 55 feet above the water. And as each wave came by, the wave crest was going by right at eye level. So the winds were coming from astern of us, and that's probably the worst position they could have been in from a stability point of view. And that's why we took that horrendous roll with all these monster tanks stuck on deck, making our stability very tender to begin with. That was the typhoon. And we get then into what the captain did, which was really quite a remarkable situation.
Well, Merle, at the same time, how was it down in the engine room riding that thing out?
Well, when we hit the typhoon, it's quite an experience to be down in an engine room where you don't have any vision of the ocean, so you can't relate, to where your ship position is. And you just kind of hang on for dear life, and certain things you have to make sure function right. The amount of water in your boilers, which is difficult because now you're turning upside down almost. And it's kind of a scary situation down in the engine room, and you're just hanging on, and you're hoping that Burley and his like up there know what they're doing, and they're not going to turn the ship upside down. And you just hang on for dear life. And the one thing we ran into was we had 2 generators, and the generators have an oil sump on them. And the oil, we had always cleaned the oil, but remember, it wasn't being stirred up. It was just on even keel because we had never had been rough water for weeks, I guess. And we got in that typhoon, and it was churning these oil sumps up, which then plugged up the filter systems and kicked out the generators. So that was a real nightmare for us to continually keep the generators going while they kicked off and cleaned the filters when we figured out what was causing them the trip. And that was a real nightmare because of that turbulence and the constant mixing up of the oil in the sumps. I remember that more than anything. Plus not being on.
Let me come back up to the main deck, because when the wave hit, you were just coming on watch at that point. And I've also read that the tanks just weren't sitting on deck, but we had soldiers on the tank. are in the tanks on the deck, right?
Yeah. They were sleeping up.
Yeah, we had, Merle, I think we had about 120 GIs from one particular company of bridge builders. They were specific guys to install these bridges. And we had, in addition to the tanks up on the main deck, we had these big, you may remember the name of these trucks that had the machine guns up over the canvas cab on the front end, and then just big troop carrying spaces at the back end. And the GIs were sleeping in those. And I remember
They were sleeping out on the deck, really, you know.
Yeah, but of course, once the typhoon started with all the rain, they were getting in shelter. But they were sleeping in the back of these big trucks. And as the tanks began to break their chain lashings, when we did that tremendous roll, they would start falling down to the starboard side because we rolled over to the right. And the trucks tipped over. And some of them that were parked adjacent to our masts with the shrouds, the heavy wire shrouds going up, holding the mast, the shrouds cut through the tops of these canvas trucks. And some of the GIs were injured, none too badly, but as these shrouds cut through the top of the trucks and the trucks turned over on their sides, it must have been a nasty place to be sleeping.
Terrible. I can't imagine a worse place.
So Burley, you record that you had just come on watch when that wave hit. Describe that wave and what happened after that.
Well, the second mate, the navigating mate, Al Golombeski, had the 4 to 8 watch, and the typhoon had come up during his watch. And 8 o'clock as I came up, it was almost dark. Remember, it's autumn. We're fairly far north, so there was still some light, but it was getting dark pretty fast. Al and I were standing out on the starboard bridge wing in the open because from there you could see better what was up ahead. Remember, we're following the next to the last ship in the starboard queue, the line. We're the very last ship. And off to our left is another line of 8 ships that were almost out of sight because of the bad weather. And then a further line of 8 ships further off to the east, to the west on the left. So I'm standing out on the starboard bridge wing with Al, just going over what had happened on his watch and the course we're steering and the number of turns that Merle was doing on the engines down below, what speed we're making, because it was very sensitive. The engineers had to keep going at a very specific number of turns to keep us in our position so we didn't run up astern of on the stern of the ship ahead of us. So Al and I are standing out there, and we're in the lee of the bridge, the solid bridge house. So the wind is not too bad over there. And you know, when you're down in the trough of these 50-foot waves, it was quite calm. Wind-wise, it was quite calm because you had this monster wall of water coming up behind you, which broke the wind. So Al and I are standing out there just talking before he gets ready to go down below. And then all of a sudden, we're taking huge rolls anyway. And all of a sudden, this one wave caught us, and we just went over very slowly. And we went over to the point where we just hung. We hung over on our starboard side. And at that point, we'd gone so far that these huge chain lashings that were holding the tanks and the trucks in place broke because suddenly they were bearing the entire weight of these 25-ton tanks. And as they broke and the tanks slid down against the bulwark along the starboard side, of course, that increased the tenderness of the ship and the tendency to turn even further over onto our side. And that was the scariest moment because you just hung there. And the positive righting arm, as they call it, to get the ship back upright is at its minimum at that point. And at that point, we just hung on to the vertical stanchions out there to keep from dropping off into the ocean on the starboard side. And she came back. It took quite a few seconds for her to come back up again. And Captain Larue was down in his cabin, one deck below. He'd been resting because obviously he'd been awake much of the trip from Tokyo. And he managed to work his way up the one set of stairs to the bridge deck and came into the wheelhouse at that point. We're still headed north on the course with the rest of the convoy.
And then go ahead and Merle, when that happened, when that big wave hit, were you down in the engine room at that point? Had the watch changed already for you guys?
Yeah, the real problem when you have the rough seas like that in the engine room is your propeller goes out of the water, and with that it speeds up the engine. Starts to overspeed, and their turbine drives. So you hope the governor starts taking control and you try to control it and slow down the engine. Otherwise, you have some real serious trouble with your turbines, your propeller. So you always worry when it comes out of the water and starts speeding up that something's going to tear apart. It makes you a little nervous. And you hope it'll get. And by the way, I think that Al Golombeski, the second mate, I think he's the one who always calculates the center of gravity with the cargo, isn't he?
Yeah, you and I had this discussion a week or so ago, Merle. The cargo layout, really, the stowage of the cargo when you're loading, is really the chief mate's main responsibility.
Oh, is it chief mate? Oh, I thought it might be a second mate.
Yeah, no, Dino Savastio, the chief mate, who did not stand a watch. Remember, the chief mate, like your chief engineer, was not a watch stander. So Golombeski's main responsibility, other than having the 4 to 8 watch in the morning and in the evening, when he could catch the stars and the moon, because in those days there was no GPS. Everything was nautical sites, navigational sites, so celestial. That was his responsibility, and he stood his watches. And then I had the 8 to 12 watch every evening and every morning.
Now, I remember you because on a nice sunny day, you'd always sit up on the railing as I went down the boiler room. And I thought of you sitting up there in the sunlight.
We weren't supposed to be sitting, unlike the Navy, we had no chairs, and I'm sure I never sat on a railing.
That's my picture of you.
Let me come back because
until the captain came in.
Captain Larue comes up to the bridge, but you guys are heeled over still pretty far at that point, and you're still in danger of potentially capsizing at that point. What happened then to come back to somewhat back on keel?
So each wave, the frequency must have been about, I would guess, but I would say between each wave crest, you had perhaps a minute, maybe 45 seconds before the next crest would come up behind you. And remember, the ship is constantly moving. So as we came back from that roll to the right, you'd continue on and do another tremendous roll to the left. But because the wind was a little bit on the port quarter coming in from the left side, the rolls to the left weren't quite as acute. So Larue gets up on the bridge within about, I would say, 3 to 4 minutes of the roll to the right. The ship is rolled back up vertically and off to the left and then going back to the right again. So the danger then is that the cargo, having shifted not only on the main deck, but on the lower decks, smaller pieces, jeeps and things, would have gone down to the right-hand side. Now you're in real trouble because you've got more weight on the right side for the next roll to be even more disastrous. So on the bridge of a merchant ship of that size, you'd have just the mate, the helmsman, because we weren't under autopilot. There was one man on the helm, and then there'd be a lookout, an ordinary seaman. So there are only 3 guys on the watch, the mate, the helmsman, and the ordinary seaman. So the skipper arrives on the bridge, and he knows exactly what's happening. He knows that we've got room ahead of us. There's enough room, fortunately. That was one of the problems. Because there was a whole line of 8 ships on our left-hand side, it was very fortunate that we weren't the first or second or third ship in our line. We were way back at the tail end, because if we'd had to make that turn to the left, as the skipper decided to do, and there'd been another line of ships over there, it might have been a very hairy thing to make that turn without coming near a ship in the other line. But fortunately, that wasn't a problem. There was enough room. But then there was the question, and I've often thought how Larue worked this out, because I think my instinct would have been, he knew that he had to turn the ship and get our bow back into the seas. because that way he'd have a lot more positive stability. The rudder is working better. You're not, as you come down a wave heading with the wave, your rudder is moving at more or less the same rate as the wave that's coming through under you. So your rudder loses effect and is no longer really steering the ship as effectively as it should. So what he had to do to keep us from swirling and yawing even more and rolling again, he had to get the bow back into the seas. That way we'd have a lot more positive effect on the rudder and stability would be better. But the question of whether to turn right or left, I think I would have been inclined, had it been my decision, to turn right, because the weight was on the right-hand side of the ship. And as I turned right, I would have thought the tendency is going to be to push the ship to the left as we come broadside to the seas. I'm getting a little too technical, but Larue calculated that a left turn was better. And when you think about it, it's the angle of the seas coming up from behind us, which were maybe at 30 degrees off the stern. He had less of a turn to make by going left instead of having to turn 180 plus 30, 210 degrees. He only had to turn about 150 degrees. So in that sense, it made sense for him to go left. He stood there very quietly for a few minutes. He was a very cool sort of character and just stood there next to the helmsman. And when he was ready, I don't think we touched the engine controls Merle at all. We had the engine telegraph to tell Merle whether to increase speed or slow down. He might have given full ahead, but I don't think so. I think we were still on full ahead, but at a reduced rate of knots because of the convoy. And he gave a hard left command. He warned both the helmsman and me that he was going to do it. And that's when it became really the most frightening, because you're turning left, so you're going broadside to these monster waves coming in right at you on a ship that's already got all its weight down on the right side, and you're turning your left side into the sea. And it was sort of a breathless, must have been about 2.5 minutes as we made that turn until we got the bow back to about 15 or 20 degrees off the oncoming seas. When we slowed down, at that point, you would have slowed down, because if you're going even at 5 or 6 knots into seas like that, I've been on other ships where the entire flare, the iron steel plates on the bow going into a sea like that, can just be bent up by one wave when they just curl right up in over the deck. The force is tremendous. So he turned the ship around, got our bow into the seas, and for the next 4 hours on my watch, we stayed steaming into the sea slowly as the typhoon passed over us and went north up toward Inchon. And then by about, I would think early in the next watch, Al Frenzon's 12 to 4 watch, the seas had reduced enough so that the skipper could turn her around, head back for Inchon, catch up with the convoy. I think, Merle, we didn't get into Inchon until about 7 or 8 in the morning, when the rest of the fleet had arrived about 5 or 6 in the morning.
So, Phil, let me come back to you. Did you cover some of that Inchon landing part in the preparation of your book?
Yes, absolutely. What you gentlemen may not know is that the storm had been bad enough that the ships carrying the 1st Marine Division, who had left Kobe day before, actually turned back because they didn't think they could make it through the storm. And it was Admiral Doyle coming down from Sasebo aboard the Mount McKinley who ordered the fleet to turn around and continue on to Inchon, since they were the lead part of the landing, with the 7th Infantry aboard the cargo ships like Meredith Victory making the administrative part. But Larue had been through, needless to say, as a longtime merchant mariner, had been through bad seas before. In 1942, in March, when he was the 2nd mate aboard the SS Macmar, as part of HX 177, which was a convoy crossing the Atlantic on its way to form up into PQ-13 on its way to Murmansk. His ship, the Mormackmar, had a deck cargo of barrels of white phosphorus. And during a strong North Atlantic gale, the barrels started to break loose. And when the tops came off, of course, the phosphorus spontaneously combusted. And there was almost a day of maneuvers to try and get the ship under control well enough that they could secure these barrels of phosphorus. Later on the same ship in January of the next year, 1943, Larue was aboard when they were going from Colombo to Fremantle, and the seas were bad enough that it actually loosened the rudder in its bushings to the point that the vibration was so bad they had to slow down to a few knots. So he'd been through some pretty serious times even before that typhoon in 1950.
Well, when you mention the other fellows coming out of Sasebo diverted, I read just the other day that the Missouri, the biggest battleship that we had out there, was supposed to be at Inchon with us, but didn't arrive till a day or two later because Doyle or the skipper, whoever it was, they decided because of the typhoon to not come directly up to the Yellow Sea the way we did, but to divert. And they were a little late getting to Inchon, so they weren't there for the initial bombardment.
So, Merle and Bernie, live in Inchon, are the Navy vessels ahead of you guys, or are y'all all moving into Inchon together at that point?
I couldn't understand that. You what?
So we've gone through the typhoon. Meredith Victory survived. She catches up. Do you guys anchor out and wait for the Navy and then the military personnel to move in and make the landing, or what takes place at that point?
No, the Navy was in there, and we came in behind them.
Remember, the lead ships in our 24-ship convoy were the command vessel that MacArthur was on, and which were major troop transport types, big P2 hulls. And they came in, but the Navy had been in there with destroyers and minesweepers and all sorts of smaller craft prior to the landing, and they'd bombarded. So that when the convoy went in, it was the 24 ships coming in after the major ships in front. But remember, the 24-ship convoy was principally commercial vessels. We had British heavy lift ships. We had all sorts of ships similar to the Meredith Victory that were carrying supplies. But the Navy certainly was in there ahead of time, Father Sinclair.
Yeah.
They formed like a C formation, and we just filled up in the center of the C formation, right? Between us and the shore was all Navy ships.
I don't recall ever seeing any of the...
We were between us and the shore.
They may have been, Merle. I don't remember seeing any in the daylight hours coming around from Japan.
Oh, yeah. I mean, one got in a harbor, Inchon.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, in Inchon. Yes, because in Inchon, and you got to tell that story about that. Now, was that the attack by air in Inchon when we got bombed, or not we got bombed, but our neighbors did? Was that the very first morning in Inchon?
Oh, at Inchon. Yeah. I was out on deck. It was early in the morning, and there were two planes came out. Now, remember, the Navy, the ships were all scattered around the harbor between us and the shore. And was it the Rochester was on the very end, right?
Rochester was just about a half mile north of us, yeah. The American cruiser.
Well, I was watching these two planes come in, and one was fairly low and the other was high. And I think they were prop planes, because at that time, you know, there was a mix between prop planes and jet planes. You know, they weren't totally jets. There was a lot of prop planes. So I was watching the planes come in, and you couldn't tell. You often wondered, you know, what nationality they were. I never dreamed of being the North Koreans or the Chinese, but I watched them come in, and the one was quite a bit higher than the other. And as they circled around over the ships, over the Navy ships, it seemed, and they passed the Rochester, and then I knew it was the enemy because the water spouted up after the Rochester, right behind it, and you knew he dropped the bombs, but he missed. after all that, he missed the target. And it seemed to me that all the ships there, they saw this plane, and they too didn't know for sure whether it was the enemy or a friend, and they were a little hesitant to fire. But once he dropped his bombs, it seemed to me like every ship fired at the same time, and the plane just disintegrated in midair, right at the back end of the Rochester. That was the last air raid we had there.
As I recall, right next to the Rochester, anchored near her, was the Jamaica, the British Royal Navy ship. And my impression after that morning, because I wasn't on deck as early as you were, was from the story I'd heard, the Rochester didn't get a shot off as these planes went over her first. And then they went over the Jamaica, and the Jamaica shot one of them down. And I was telling about a year and a half, 2 years later, I was on active duty in the Navy, and they assigned me to London to Admiral Chillingworth's staff on Grosvenor Street. And the Admiral had a cocktail party shortly after I got there. There were about 5 or 6 officers on his staff. It was a very small group. And I was telling the story of that morning to one of the commanders on our staff, Pat Lair, who'd been in Inchon that morning. And I said, I didn't realize that Admiral Chillingworth had been on the Rochester that morning. And I was telling Commander Lair about this disgraceful morning when the Rochester was sound asleep early when the 2 planes came over and dropped the bombs. And Lair said, hush, he said, keep that quiet. He said, the Admiral was there that morning on the Rochester. And I said, I had been saying what a shame it was. The British got the shots off and shot one down, but not the other. But you were lucky enough to see all that. I was still in bed, I think.
They were. I'm convinced they were trained into their guns on that plane as it came over, because they instantly shot at one time when they saw the explosion, and you knew that was an enemy plane and missed.
Yeah, I read recently.
And the other plane was up high, and he kind of went over the hill and disappeared.
Yeah. There was something I read recently. One of the planes was supposed to be an Ilyushin, one of the Russian fighters. They were small planes, if I recall the way you told me.
There was a big plane.
It was or was not a big plane?
It was not a big plane.
No, one was an Ilyushin. The other one, I think, was a MiG.
Yeah, not sure what they were.
Yeah.
Well, we've made an important story here about the Meredith Victory, Captain Larue taking the ship from Norfolk, bringing it around, coming to Japan, and then, in a way, miraculously keeping from capsizing at that point, because the story continues with the Meredith Victory and Captain Larue and you guys sailing back and forth from Japan to Korea after the Inchon landing during supplies. But then, to just jump forward to December, we have the Chinese come in to the war. You have the Chosin Reservoir. You have the retreat to Hungnam. And then the really great story of the Christmas miracle when you guys, with Captain Larue, rescued 14,000 North Koreans in your Victory ship at that point and brought them to Busan and then on to Jochi Island. Saving that story for later, but we have to also recognize that if the Meredith Victory would have been lost in that typhoon, which was certainly a possibility because of the situation, a little more cargo shifting, another rogue wave hitting it in the port quarter could have sent y'all over with, and history would have been so much different in the context if that would have happened. Not only would have about 1 million people not been born, because they've traced that relationship between the 14,000 and 1 million descendants that have come from them over the 7 years. But also the president of Korea today would not be the president of Korea today, because his parents and sister would have been lost on the Meredith Victory at that point. With me also today is Doreen Bada, who is our Secretary General for the Apostleship of the See of the United States of America, which is the Association of the Christian Faithful, who are promoting the cause for Captain Larue, Brother Marinus. Certainly, they can contact you for greater information that's there. How would they do that?
So I can be contacted at AOSUSA@sbcglobal.net. or by phone at 409-985-4545. And there is a page about Brother Marinus on our website at www.aos-usa.org. And this is a cause that we're very excited about. When we hear the story today about the Inchon landing, it makes me think of It's a Wonderful Life and how that, one person can make such a difference. And of course, in the case of Leonard, Captain Larue, it wasn't just him. It was the men who were on board with him, like Bob Lenny and Burley and Merle Smith, who followed him. But it's a great story, and we really want to encourage people to get behind the cause for Brother Marinus. Think about it. This is a U.S. merchant mariner who did a lot of good and could be a saint one day. And so we appreciate your help with this.
And so I want to close and just turn over to Phil. Phil is working on a biography of Captain Larue and captures a lot of these ideas. Phil, do you have a comment at the Inchon landing piece? And then just tell us what is your work and when do you anticipate this thing being published?
Well, we're striving to get the book published in time for the 70th anniversary of the Hungnam evacuation. So we're working on getting it published by the end of the year. I think there are a couple of elements that tie Inchon with Hungnam in an interesting way. One is, of course, the Meredith Victory, Captain Larue, and the men you have on the screen here. Another is that you mentioned Ned Forney earlier. His grandfather, Colonel Edward Forney, was also key to planning the Inchon invasion. And it was in part his extraordinary service to MacArthur's staff that led to him being named Deputy Chief of Staff for General Ahmad at 10th Corps when they landed at Wonsan on the East Coast. And then Ullman's confidence in Forney that made him the so-called control officer for the evacuation. So if it had not been for the performance of the Marines and the planning on a very short timescale, led by Colonel Forney, the Hungnam evacuation might not have been as successful as it was.
So I want to thank in a very special way Dave Gardy and Maritime TV for allowing us to come together and capture these memories and observing the 70th anniversary of the Inchon landing. It's part of American history. Dorian's father served in Korea. I was an associate pastor with a priest who had served in Korea. He actually did the whole run. He was there at the beginning, went down to Busan, then went back up again, and then went back down again and came back up again. So he had quite a number of experiences of the whole Korean event. So we hope to be able to, as we get closer to December, do something special to remember the 70th anniversary of the rescue that took place in Hungnam. But a special big thanks to Dave for allowing us to do the show today. Big thanks to Burley. Thank you for sharing these memories and thoughts with us. And Merle, it's been great to finally seeing you physically in the screen. And thank you for your stories from the engine room also. Phil, good luck on getting your book published. Thank you.
Thank you.
There's another part of the Inchon invasion that was interesting, and that is after the landing and all, what was interesting to us, we could finally go ashore and follow the troops up to Seoul and see what they were doing. So we wound up in Seoul while they were still fighting for the city. As we were just tourists then, but it was kind of interesting with the troops. They wondered what we were doing there.
You remember, Merle, at one point when we hitchhiked up from Busan to Seoul, when the line was just north of the Han River there at Seoul.
That's what I remember.
We arrived, there were three of us, I think, you, Lonnie, and I. And we arrived just after dark. We had to walk the last mile or two. The tank that was going back up to the line that we'd hitchhiked on dropped us off. So we're on this dark dirt road, and we walked to Kimpo Airfield, which was the main base at that time for the air. And the planes were coming in from Japan with troops and supplies and landing in the pattern. Their lights were all on. We get to the gate, three of us in civilian sort of khakis. And the guard didn't know what the hell to do with us, coming in out of the dark. he let us in, and we went into this bombed out headquarters where there were a bunch of enlisted men, sergeants, taking care of I guess it was sort of a headquarters for the operational section. And we said, we got to get back to go to work on our ship. We just had the day off, and we're 150 miles north of Busan, or 200 miles, and we were going to be late. And they said, okay, just sit here and we'll see what we can do about getting you a flight down to Busan in the middle of the night. And all of a sudden, as we're sitting there are no windows. They've all been bombed out of this brick building that we're in. And all of a sudden, there are two tremendous booms right behind the building, and debris starts falling on the roof, what was left of the roof. And I've never seen people dive out windows before, physically. And the GIs that were in there manning this particular post dove headfirst out through these open windows. And Lenny and I didn't know what the hell to do, so we walked out the front door and hid under a truck.
I remember that.
It turned out that what the GIs thought, that it was a Chinese mortar platoon that had somehow gotten into the area and was dropping mortars on us. Excuse me, let me get rid of this. So anyway, immediately they shut down the airfield. Everything that was in the air on final approach had to turn around, go back to Japan. And the sergeant said to us, well, you guys are stuck here for the night. It turned out that they were bombs from a guy they called Bed Check Charlie, who would come over in a small sort of Piper Cub thing in the evening sometimes. He'd get into the pattern with his lights on, they told us. And then he'd kick a couple of bombs out the window over the airfield, but it would shut down the airfield for the evening. So it was the coldest night I ever spent. Sergeant, I don't know where you slept. It wasn't in my tent, but I was on a canvas cot with one blanket that the sergeant rustled up somewhere. And I was never so cold in my life. In the morning, I remember a young lieutenant, spick and span sort of fellow Army, came up to us and he said, who the hell are you guys? Are you correspondents? And we said, no, we're just trying to get back to our ship. We're merchant sailors. And he said, you're not supposed to be up here. And we said, yes, we know we're not supposed to be here. And they put us on a plane, a DC-3 that was going back to Daegu and then on to Busan. And I remember they filled it up with people like the young kid sitting next to me was a private who they'd taken out of the line and were sending him back to Japan because his brother had been killed in the Second War. And they were beginning to pick out troops who had had fatalities in the family because of military service. So he was being sent to a safer place back in Japan. But the plane had these little aluminum bucket seats on the sides, and then they filled the center aisle with mail bags so that you couldn't move, you couldn't walk up and down the aisle. And as we flew south, it was a very cloudy day and we were under the overcast. And the cemeteries in Korea are all on top of the hills. So we're flying along, looking out the window at all these cemeteries that are going by the windows because we're only at about 2,000 feet as we're flying south. But I recall that was a fun weekend, but cold. And by the end of October, when this was, it was really bitterly cold there.
I remember the troops, when they heard that we were just civilians sightseeing, they couldn't believe that we'd be wandering around Korea, that we didn't get to go home. Remember that? That surprised them.
Yeah.
They didn't understand that at all.
No.
Well, thank you very much, guys, for your being with us today and being able to capture these stories, not just for the September 15th observance that we're doing, but also really for history. So thank you very much for that. And Dave, thank you for for hosting us today.
Thank you. We appreciate it. Excellent story. I want to thank everybody here, including Merlin Burley. Great stories, and we're going to try to get this up by the 15th of September. And hopefully down the time when the celebration occurs for the anniversary of the Hungnam evacuation, we'll probably try to do something for that too. From Maritime TV studios near Washington, D.C., I'm Dave Gardy. Thanks for joining us for this special Maritime TV presentation.